بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضاه والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, this is session 8 in module 5 covering the fiqh of salat, and we're coming to the end of this session. This is spanning, we're now at 2 months, so we'll probably finish this up in the next session after tonight. And in module 5 covering the fiqh of prayer, out of all of the sessions, this one is probably the most complicated of them all. And that's because it addresses issues that are usually confusing to a lot of people, particularly in the area of sajdatul sahu, or the prostration of forgetfulness, what you do when you forget something, when you omit something, or you add too much. That area is sometimes confusing for people. That's what we want to cover tonight. After that, coming next week, it's relatively straightforward issues that we cover in our Fard Ain. And as a reminder to myself and to all of you, this is individually obligatory knowledge, meaning this is not extracurricular Islam. This is not inspiring talks and stories, things that you don't have to know. These are all details that we have to know. Even if not everything is obligatory in and of itself, to know how these things work is obligatory so that our prayers are valid, inshaAllah ta'ala. So far, if we go and trace our steps on this journey of learning the Fard Ain in Salat, we've learned the conditions for the obligation of prayer. So, Islam, maturity, and sanity. We then learned the cause for the obligation of prayer, meaning the entrance of its time. The conditions for the validity of prayer, and we said that conditions are external to the prayer, and the things that are internal to the prayer are known as pillars. And so we covered the pillars of the prayer, the arkan, and the obligations, the wajibat, as well as the sunnahs. We talked about the reasons for some of the differences we see between people in how they pray, why some people pray with the hands here or there. And we looked at the basis for all of those practices, all of which are based on legitimate differences based on ijtihad among the ulama. We then looked at the adab of prayer, what invalidates the prayer, what is disliked to do in the prayer, what is permissible in prayer, and finally we talked a little bit about how one may break the prayer if they have to break it for whatever reason. So we've covered all of those things so far, alhamdulillah. And what we want to cover tonight are 4 matters: the Witr prayer, the prayer of the traveler, the emphasized Sunnah prayers, and the prostration of forgetfulness. So we've saved the hardest for last. So these are the 4 things we want to cover tonight. Now, in the legal school of Imam Malik and Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Witr prayer is a highly emphasized sunnah. It's not seen as obligatory, wajib. However, in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, which is the basis for this program, the Witr prayer is seen as wajib. But we have to remember that distinction within the school of Imam Abu Hanifa between what is fard and what is wajib. There is a distinction there. That distinction is not found in the other schools in their respective usul. So this is when we hear wajib according to the Hanafi school, it shouldn't be confused for wajib according to the other schools. They're not using wajib in the same way the other schools use wajib. So in the previous lessons, we've covered everything to do with the actual form of the prayer, how you pray, and the different degrees of actions and things in the prayer. Now we're looking at not the structure of the prayer itself, but at certain types of prayers or issues that arise that affect how we offer those prayers. So the prayer of the traveler is the same prayer as the person who's resident. It's same. You have the same rak'ahs, the same things you're reading in prayer. All of the ahkam that apply to how you perform it will be the same whether you're resident or traveler. But there's an issue with traveling, a certain difference in terms of the number of rak'ahs, for instance. So looking at the witr prayer, it is wajib in the Hanafi school and an emphasized sunnah in the other schools. And the proof within the Hanafi school for the wujub, the obligation as they see it for witr, is the constant prophetic practice as well as certain narrations which indicate that it's wajib. And this is a kind of an usuli discussion about how they derive that proof. But we have hadith, for instance, where the Prophet ﷺ says, "Awtiru ya ahl al-Qur'an." He gives it as a command. Pray the witr, O people of the Qur'an. So the basic default is that when there's a command, al-amr yufid al-wujub. The command indicates obligation, unless there's some other proof to indicate that it's not an obligation. We have the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, the witr is a duty, so he who does not observe it is not from us. فَلَيْسَ مِنَّا. So this is kind of a threat. So this is an indication, according to the Hanafi scholars, that it is wajib. Now, the form of the witr prayer in the Hanafi school is, to keep it simple, just think, on the surface, it looks exactly like the Maghrib prayer. That's all you really have to know. That plus how to do qunut. Just say to yourself, witr in the Hanafi school is exactly like the Maghrib prayer in terms of how you pray it and the tashahhud and so on. There are other ways within other schools, but in the Hanafi school, it consists of 3 rak'ahs prayed together in a single prayer with one set of salams. Right? And it's recommended, according to some hadith, in the witr prayer to recite in the first rak'ah, Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la, Surah al-A'la, and in the second rak'ah, Surah al-Kafirun, and in the third rak'ah, Surah al-Ikhlas. It's recommended. In the third rak'ah, before you go into ruku', you look at me, I'm raising my hands. You don't raise your hands in the Hanafi school. But in the third rak'ah, before you go into ruku', you are to do what is called the qunut. The qunut. And the qunut is basically a dua. It is a devotional dua. Qunut comes from the Arabic word that means devout, dedication or devotion. وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ. Right? The qanit is mentioned in the Quran. So the qunut is a kind of dua. And before you go into ruku', you recite the qunut, and that is after you recite the surah, before you go into ruku'. After you recite the surah, as you're doing the qunut, you raise the hands to the level of the ears and say Allahu Akbar and read the qunut. So there's different ways of doing it in the other schools. So basically, you say you're praying in the third rak'ah, you recited the Fatiha and another chapter, say Surah Ikhlas. According to the Hanafi school, you're raising the hands to the level of the ears, you say Allahu Akbar and supplicate with the qunut, and then you go into ruku' and you complete your prayer. Now this is how the Hanafi school does it. In the other schools, it's a little bit different. For instance, in the Shafi'i school and in the Maliki school, we do the qunut in Fajr and not in Witr. Right? And that qunut is silent. And the Imam is usually doing it in the masjid. or the person praying by themselves is doing it silently before ruku'. In the Maliki school, it's before ruku', although there is a position that could be after if one forgot. But that's in Fajr for the Shafi'is and Malikis, but for the Hanafis, it's in the Witr and not in the Fajr. So there is a dua for qunut that is transmitted in the Hadith, and there's a few different wordings of this dua. But the wording preferred and mentioned in the Hanafi legal literature is this dua. So we're not going to read the whole thing and translate it, but no matter what you're doing here, you need to make sure that you're memorizing these du'as, right? So praying the witr, if you're doing the qunut, you need to know this du'a. But let's say you're working with it. You have a hard time memorizing, it takes you a while. What do? Well, if you have not memorized the qunut for whatever reason, then they say that instead of that, you say 3 times, Allahumma ighfirli, Allahumma ighfirli, Allahumma ighfirli, oh Allah, forgive me. Or you say the dua within the ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. So these are alternatives for the person who hasn't memorized that dua, because if you look at the dua, it's a little bit lengthy, and for someone who hasn't encountered it, it may take them a little while to memorize that. But they work for it, they memorize it, inshallah. Now, let's say you come to the masjid and you're praying behind someone who is in Fajr reading the qunut. So this is someone who's doing it according to the Shafi'i way or the Maliki way. They don't have qunut in Witr, they have qunut in Fajr. You are behind them and they're doing the qunut. You don't normally do the qunut in Fajr. What do? Well, the fuqaha say that you perform it with the imam silently with your hands by your side. So what you'll see, I know you've all noticed this, you have salat in jama'ah and the imam, like this happened I think last week with the khatam. This happened with the khatam last week. In the khatam, in the prayer at the last rak'ah, there was a dua. And you may have noticed that a lot of people raised their hands, and then there were people who didn't raise their hands. Both of those are fine, but in the Hanafi school, if you're praying behind someone reading the qunut and they raise their hands, you still keep your hands by your side and you keep silent. It's absolutely fine. You do it in this way. Because your qunut is in Witr, your qunut is not in Fajr, but you're still behind the imam, so you're following him. So let's say you, as a Hanafi, you're praying your qunut, your Witr, and before you go to bed, and you're tired, and you're so tired that you forgot to do the qunut, and you realized while you're in ruku' that you forgot your qunut. Do you rise back up, Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then recite the qunut? The answer is no. You rise from ruku', Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana lakal hamd. You continue with the rest of your prayer. You come to the end, and then you do your prostration of forgetfulness. So in the Hanafi school, if you forget qunut, you have to do the prostration of forgetfulness. And we're going to talk about that at the end, how we do that. So those are the basic issues for the witr and the qunut. And in the next class, next week, when we talk about make-up prayers, qada, we'll make mention of this point, that qada would also include qada of missed witrs in the Hanafi school. Whereas in the others, it would just be the 5 fard. So, having discussed that, we now come to the prayer of the musafir, salatul musafir, the traveler. So as we said, we've already learned now the structure of the prayer, how we do it, the things that are pillars, conditions, obligations, sunnas, adab, and so on and so forth. Now we're looking at certain conditions that may arise which may alter the way in which we perform the same prayer we just learned. One of them is the prayer of the traveler. Now, it is from the mercy of Allah Ta'ala that in the Sharia He gave to the Prophet ﷺ, the traveler has certain rukhas, certain dispensations, certain allowances that they can take advantage of, that they can avail themselves to, that are not available to a person who is resident, right? We mentioned in module 4 that if you're a traveler and you put on the khuf, how long do you have to wipe over your khuf if you're traveling? 72 hours. If you're a resident, you have how long? 24. So the traveler has a certain rukhsa, a dispensation to make it easier for them on their journey. They can wipe over the socks for 72 hours. Likewise, if you're traveling, if you're traveling in Ramadan, you can break your fast, even if you're not sick, even if you're not that tired. It's not necessarily advisable because, it's just better often to just continue if it's not a hardship, so you don't have to make it up later. But if a person's traveling and they just don't feel like fasting, maybe they have a business meeting and they want to be fresh and focused and they're traveling, they can break their fast and have a coffee, and there is no blame on them whatsoever. That is allowed to them. That's a rukhsa, a dispensation. If you're traveling as a man, it's not wajib on you to attend Jumu'ah. If you're traveling and it's Eid, it's not wajib for you to go to Eid. Does that mean you shouldn't? No, but you don't have to. Now, in the other schools, the Shafi'i school, the Maliki school, the Hanbali school, we would add traveling. One of the rukhsas to traveling is the shortening prayer. But in the Hanafi school, they think a little bit differently about this issue. They don't say that shortening the prayer is a rukhsa or dispensation for the person who is traveling. They say it's an obligation. Very different. So in the Hanafi school, they don't say when you're traveling at a certain distance for a certain period of time, it is a dispensation where you're allowed to shorten your prayers. They say, no, you must shorten your prayers as long as you fulfill those conditions. So this is something unique to the Hanafi school. They see it as an azima, as a stricture and not a rukhsa. So there's a lot of questions that come up with regards to travel and what constitutes travel that would allow one to shorten the prayer. And we should talk about that. Of course, as always, there's differences of opinion among the fuqaha about these details. But within the Hanafi school, the view transmitted is that the least distance for travel for these rulings to take effect is 48 miles, which is around 77 kilometers. Meaning, for you to shorten your prayers while on a journey, that journey has to go at 48 miles and beyond. If it's less than that, you're not considered a traveler. You're still a resident, albeit on the road. So this doesn't mean that you have to have a GPS tracker and you have it right down to the foot, okay? Where you say, well, I'm 47 miles and 5,000 feet, I can't shorten my prayer. It's not that exact. It's always approximation. And the question people ask is, how did they determine it to be 48 miles? Why not 47? Why not 49? Is this an arbitrary number that people just came up with? And the answer is no. It is, like we said, an estimation. And the estimation is based on the pre-modern way of measuring distance. Now, there's lots of ways people would measure distance in the pre-modern period. And there's different terms they would use to describe distances, farasikh and so on. Even the word mil for mile. But for travel in particular, it was described as 3 days journey by camel or foot for an average an average kind of land without large mountains or barriers. So if you get on a camel and you ride at an average pace, and you get off and walk a little bit, and you take a break, and you go, and then you camp out, and you do that for 3 days, that is the average distance at which you would be able to shorten your prayers. That's estimated as around 48 miles, right? And they calculate it a little differently for when a person is on a boat or if they're in a mountainous area, but more or less it comes down to this general distance. And in the past, they would also describe how this would relate to a person leaving the amsar, leaving the metropolis, the city limits, and getting past the area of the city where you can no longer see it. So there's all these details. What concerns us is just making sure that we've gone about 48 miles, give or take, at which these ahkam take effect and we're considered musafir. So when a person's left the city limits of their residence and they intend to travel to a place that they will reach at that distance or beyond, they shorten their 4 rak'ah prayers to 2 rak'ah prayers. What is this called? This is called qasr, shortening. There is this other thing that we call jama', which is gathering, where the person would pray dhuhr and asr back to back, or they would pray maghrib and isha back to back. That doesn't exist in the Hanafi school, except for the person who is at Hajj on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah and the 10th, right? At Arafah, Muzdalifah. That's when they shorten, that's it. And that's when they shorten and gather. They don't do it any other time. But for the other schools, it's a little more lenient. If a person is praying dhuhr and asr, 2 rak'ah dhuhr, 2 rak'ah asr at dhuhr time, and they're a traveler, or according to the other schools, that's valid. It's not always preferable, but it's valid. But in the Hanafi school, you couldn't do that. Likewise, you wouldn't be praying maghrib and isha together, with maghrib prayed fully and then isha as 2 rak'ahs. You wouldn't do that. Although in the other schools, that would be valid. I'm not sure how it is in the Shafi'i school, but in the Maliki school, this shortening and gathering is only preferable when you're on the road, on the journey itself. And praying each prayer in its own time would cause a delay in the trip, right? This means that if you're on the road and let's say you're in transit somewhere in an airport and you have a 4-hour layover and you have time to pray dhuhr at dhuhr and asr, it wouldn't really be needed for you to gather between the two and pray them back to back, because you could pray dhuhr and then you could pray asr 2 and 2, right? Anyhow, this shortening, we said, is considered wajib in the Hanafi school. It's not seen as a rukhsa, it's an azima. Once a person reaches a city or a location and they intend to stay there for at least 15 full days, they must complete the 4 rak'ah obligatory prayers rather than shortening them. This is important to note. It's not an open-ended thing where as long as you're out away from home, traveling somewhere, you just shorten your prayers for the entire duration of your trip. If that trip is for 15 days or longer, you are considered like a resident, and you resort back to the default, which is praying each prayer in its particular time as 4 rak'ahs, right? If you're staying at a place for 13 days, 10 days, 12 days, even 14, you continue shortening your prayers. That's fine. But if it's 15 or longer, you go back to the norm, which is 4 rak'ahs for those prayers. Now, the journey of the traveler is going to end on entering the city limits of his normal place of residence. or when he makes an intention of staying at another town for 15 days or more. If one intends to remain less than 15 days, or does not intend his length of stay, and remains longer without a fixed intention and not knowing when he will depart, he may continue to shorten the prayers. This one, I want to give you an example for this one. I believe it was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. He was traveling north in Azerbaijan. There's a very well-known athar from him. And he's musafir. And on the way back, it began to snow. Imagine how it was back then before there were roads. If you get snowed in a mountainous region, you're stuck. So he didn't go there intending to settle. He wants to go, but he's prevented. But he's not sure when the snow is going to melt and when he's going to be able to get back on the road to get home. And during that entire period until the snow melted, he was shortening his prayers. And this is used as a proof to indicate, this is how the Sahaba understood the issue, that if you know you're here 15 days or longer, you go back to the norm, right? 4 rak'ahs for Dhuhr and Asr and Isha. But if you intend to stay less than 15 days, or you don't have a particular intention, like you're not staying 14 or 10 or 20, you're passing through, you're not sure how long you're going to be there, and you're remaining longer, such as being stuck, and you don't have a fixed intention, and you're not sure when you're leaving, you can actually continue the shortening of the prayers for as long as that issue remains. This is very unlikely to ever happen to anyone, but it's there. Let's look at a couple of scenarios, common scenarios. Let's take Zayd, this imaginary figure, Zayd. Now Zayd is from New York City, and he's boarding a flight from JFK to London. So at JFK, is he considered a traveler at JFK? No, because he's from New York City. So he's going on a flight from JFK to London, and he intends to remain in London for 17 days. As a traveler, he's shortening his prayers on his way to London. So presumably while he's on the flight, whatever prayers are happening, or if there's any transit and he's praying, he's shortening those prayers. Once he arrives in London, he's going to discontinue that shortening. He's going to go back to the norm of praying the prayers in the full 4 rak'ahs. Why? Because he intended to stay longer than 15 days. If, let's say, he was going for 12 days. If he's going for 12 days, anything less than 15, he'll shorten his prayers for the duration of the trip. Right? And on his way back to JFK, he'll shorten his prayers, and that will discontinue once he arrives at JFK. Because being in JFK, he's back in his city. So that rule about shortening no longer applies once he's returned to his home city, his residence. Let's take the example of Khalid. Now Khalid, he intends to stay in Mecca and Medina for 20 days. But he doesn't specify his residence at one of the 2 locations. Let's just say, he's a free agent. He's not with a group. He's going for Umrah and Ziyarah, and he's booking his own hotels. All he has is a return ticket back to JFK. So he arrives in Mecca. He wants to go to Mecca and Medina. The ticket is for 20 days. He's going to be 20 days in the Hijaz. But he hasn't specified how long he's going to stay in Mecca or Medina. If you look at the number 20, that's beyond 15. But he hasn't specified where he's going to stay. Is he going to stay 5 days here, and then 15 days here? Is it going to be 8 days here and then 7 days there? He hasn't specified, even though it's 20 days in total that he's gone on his journey. In this case, because he hasn't specified, he'll shorten the prayers even though he's traveling longer than 15 days. Once he specifies, things may change. Because let's say he decides to do 4 days in Mecca and then the remaining 16 days in Medina. He's traveling, intending to be in the city of Medina for 16 days. He goes back to praying the prayers in the normal length. Okay, next issue. If a traveler offers prayer behind a resident imam, the traveler follows the imam and completes the 4 rak'ahs. I think this is pretty basic. When a person is behind the imam, they're following the imam all the way through. If you're a traveler and it's dhuhr, praying dhuhr by yourself is 2 rak'ahs. But if you're praying behind an imam who's resident, you're not going to go into the second rak'ah and then cut out with your own salams while the rest of the jama'ah finishes dhuhr. You don't do that. You get up with the imam and you go through all 4. That's absolutely fine. And the reverse is also true. It's valid, it's permissible for a traveler to lead people in salat who are resident. But you have to be mindful of people and try to prevent any possible confusion from arising. I'm sure this has happened to some of you. You go somewhere and there's a person leading the salat and they are a traveler. You're a resident. You've come to pray dhuhr. This person prays 2 rak'ahs and gives salams, and like, what's going on here? That person should notify people. They can do it after the taslim, right? نحن على سفر, or something like نحن مسافرون أتموا صلاتكم فإننا بسفر. You can say different things in Arabic or whatever language to notify the people that you are a traveler as an imam, and they should complete the rest of their salat. One issue that a lot of people don't think about is what happens if you're traveling, and as a musafir you can shorten your prayers. You're traveling, and let's say you're on the way back. So on the road, on the way back home, you're driving, you're still traveling, and you forget to pray Asr. Well, let's say you forget to pray Dhuhr, that's better. You forget to pray Dhuhr. You get back home, you walk in the front door and you realize, oh, I didn't pray Dhuhr, and it's now Asr time. What do? You missed Dhuhr, so whatever you do, that Dhuhr is qada, it's makeup for a missed Dhuhr. However, because it was obligatory, the time was in as you were on a journey, you're going to pray it as 2 rak'ahs even though you're home. So you come in the door, you realize I missed Dhuhr, which happened hours ago when I was on the road. You make the intention of qada, of makeup, you pray the Dhuhr as 2 rak'ahs, and then you're going to pray your Asr normally because that came in as you were making your way into your residence. So, some of these areas are sometimes confusing for people. And inshallah, we have any questions, we can address them bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Maybe we'll take those now and see. Are there any questions about travel? Yeah.
What if you don't forget to pray? Like you just can't pray on the plane, you miss it, so you get home, you still pray it?
Well, if you can't pray standing in the airplane, you just pray sitting, right?
Okay. You said, but whenever you get home, you still make it up, right?
You have that option, yes. Yeah, and yeah,
2 or 4?
it would be 2 because that was wajib when you were on the road. So you are praying it as the 2 rak'ahs, and the intention is a makeup. But this case, you don't. If a person prayed on the airplane sitting down, and they did not have the ability to pray standing, otherwise they would, and they pray sitting down, they don't have to make up those prayers, right? It's valid in the Hanafi school for sure. So you wouldn't need to do that, but you could if you khurujan min khilaf, to avoid the difference of opinion one could do that. That option's available. Yeah.
So about the truck drivers or pilots?
Raise your voice.
Yeah, what about the truck drivers or pilots or like people in army? How do they pray?
Truck drivers?
Yeah. They shorten their prayers or?
Yeah, it doesn't matter how often you take the journey, right? There are people who, like a common fatwa, a common question put to mashayikh. Person A is studying in a university that is 57 miles away from their home. And they go there 4 days a week and they go back to their parents' home. Are they shortening their prayers every time they're there, even though they're there week after week? The answer is yes. Because unless they have a dorm and they're living there, right? We're assuming they're there temporarily and their actual home is somewhere else. For a truck driver, it's even clearer because they're on the road. So it doesn't matter how often they're on the road, they're not fixed in any one place. So as long as they're in that state, they're in a state of travel. If a person is traveling from point A to point B and they're staying in point B for 15 days or more, that's when they resume praying normally with 4 rak'ahs. Same thing for the pilots, right? It doesn't matter how often it happens. Yeah.
The same applies to if you're traveling for work each day.
Yeah.
And it's outside of that.
Yeah, you don't live at work. You know, if your office, I know of people, I know of people who are driving 50 miles one way. So every day at work, they're actually considered a musafir. They don't live at work. They don't live in that town. They don't have a second home in that town. So, most people who are doing that, they're not actually shortening their prayers. But the option is there. And in the Hanafi school, you should be, if that's the case. Even if you're there 5 days a week, doesn't matter. Because the hukum is you are a traveler because you fit those conditions. Yeah.
Question, because a lot of times people do it is like they start shortening or they start combining prayers before even leaving house because they're musafir, so they're still at home and they start taking this rukhsah because they're tend to travel a few hours.
Yeah, you gotta at least leave the city limits.
They can't do it at the airport, like at Pittsburgh airport. You can't do it even there. You have to do it after you leave the city.
Yeah, there's some discussion about whether you could do it once you left the city limits, and a lot of these airports are outside of the city limits, even though they're not at 48 miles. But you should be covering that distance before you start applying this. For the other madhahib, it's the rukhsa, or the Hanafis, it's the azima. Either way, you want to fulfill these conditions. Yeah.
If a person in an occupation where, let's say, Maghrib comes in, and it's dangerous for them to leave before Maghrib, is that frowned upon or
If this is the person traveling, or their resident. So what's the question again?
So if the person's in an occupation where it's dangerous for them to leave during the time of Maghrib, is it sensible for them to delay until that?
That it depends on what you mean by dangerous. So unless you want to specify.
Like the safety wise, let's say hypothetically like military or police.
Yeah, it's still a bit.
Or a construction operation.
Yeah, it's still ambiguous because we have to define what is the threat and what other means may be there to allow the person to offer the prayer still within the time while having someone else keep watch. I think that's a little too specific for the general Q&A. Those kinds of specific questions require a lot more detail to look into the specifics of the person's situation. But feel free to fill me in later if you want, inshallah. Khair. Any questions on the sister side? Okay. Yes.
If a person is born in a place and they don't live there, and when they go to visit that place, can they shorten their prayer?
Can you repeat the question?
If a person is born in a place and they don't live there, and when they go to visit the same place, can they still
they're not a resident anymore. Yeah. Whether you were born there or not, the question is not your ties to that place historically. The question is, are you a resident or a traveler? If you are a resident, maybe you have multiple residents. Maybe you got it like that, where you have, you have a beach house in Malibu, maybe. If that's your house, and you live there too, sure. But just because you were born there doesn't mean it remains your residence forever. Your residence is where you live, right? So if you're there for...
If you own it, like, if you have a family home, which maybe
You could own it, but is it a place that you live in for any significant amount of time?
the ownership doesn't define your resident status.
No. If you're living there, or you have multiple residences, sure. But if it's just a property, or if it's like she mentions, her birthplace, that doesn't confer on it a status of residence in and of itself. Allahu A'lam. Okay, so we have two issues here: the Sunnah prayers and the Sajdatul Sahw, the prostration of forgetfulness. And I'm a little worried about that last one tonight. We may have to postpone that for next week, because it's kind of all or nothing. If I go a quarter ways into it and the adhan for Isha goes, it won't be good. So now we come to the Sunnah prayers. Why are we talking about Sunnah prayers? Isn't this about Fard Ain, things that are obligatory for us to know? Well, we have to know about the Sunnah prayers, especially in the Hanafi school. Because in the Hanafi school, the Sunnah Mu'akkada, the highly emphasized Sunnahs, have a legal status that is very serious, and leaving them habitually is sinful. Therefore, to avoid that sin, we need to know what they are and how they're maintained. So there's different kinds of Sunnah prayers. There are the highly emphasized, the Sunnah Mu'akkada, highly emphasized prayers. There are the recommended mandub, mustahab prayers that aren't at the same degree of emphasis. And then you have more open-ended nafil prayers that are voluntary prayers. Then you have specific Sunnah prayers that aren't highly emphasized but encouraged. Regardless of the type, the general wisdom behind the Sunnah prayers is that the Sunnah prayers repair and mend what is deficient in the obligatory prayer. The Sunnah prayers are mending and repairing the inattentiveness and the lack of focus and presence that we have in the Fard prayer. So wherever those gaps are, the Sunnah prayers come to support them and mend it and make it better. Now these emphasized Sunnah prayers are called Mu'akkada, emphasized, because they are very close to the ruling of wajib. In the Hanafi school, these are very close to being wajib, especially with regard to sin, or the sinfulness of omitting them. Because in the Hanafi school, if something is a highly emphasized sunnah and a person omits it purposely and persistently and without excuse, this entails blame and sin. That is not the case with all of the other madhahib. It's still blameworthy to an extent if a person does that constantly and purposely, but we're not going to say the person is asi, is disobedient or muthnib, sinful. But in the Hanafi school, these are very much emphasized, and this is why you will notice the difference between if you go to the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and the masajid that have subcontinental majorities, the attention given to the Sunnah prayers tends to be much higher than in other parts of the world that are on different madhahib. where yes, there are sunnah prayers, of course, but they don't have the same degree of emphasis where as you do in the Hanafi school. So what are these? In the Hanafi school, the emphasized sunnah prayers are divided into two. Those that are 2 rak'ahs and those that are 4 rak'ahs. The 2 rak'ah emphasized sunnah prayers are the ones before Fajr, the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, and these are the most emphasized out of all of the sunnah prayers. The most emphasized. After that, you have the 2 rak'ahs after Dhuhr, the 2 rak'ahs after Maghrib, and the 2 rak'ahs after Isha. These are the ones that are emphasized as 2 rak'ah prayers. Then you have those that are 4 rak'ah prayers, which are highly emphasized. Those before Dhuhr, the ones before the Friday prayer, and those after the Friday prayer. So, if you're doing all of these, count them up. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 and 12, 14 and 16, 18 and 20. That's if it's a Friday, or it's not a Friday, but if you can't take away Dhuhr and just look at Jum'ah, you have how many? There's 16 or 18. Anyhow, you have a lot. So these are emphasized. Now for the 4 rak'ah prayers, when we say 4 rak'ahs, we don't mean 2 rak'ahs, Assalamu alaikum, then another 2 rak'ahs, mathnan, 2 and 2. We actually mean 4 with 1 salam. So it's like dhuhr, right? It's not separated as 2 rak'ahs and 2 rak'ahs. So before dhuhr or before Jum'ah and after Jum'ah. These are the highly emphasized prayers, sunnah prayers. The non-emphasized ones would be 4 before Asr, 4 before Isha, and 4 after Isha, and 6 after Maghrib, with 3 sets of salams. 2, 4, 6. But the sunnah of Maghrib, after Maghrib, the regular 2 rak'ahs, that could be counted as one of the 3 sets. Now, these are non-emphasized sunnah. So if someone is doing these in this list, but they're not doing these, they're not seen as sinful for persistently or just leaving them, not doing them. These are the ones that are highly emphasized in this slide, not these. Then you have others which are non-emphasized recommended sunnah prayers. The 2 greetings, the 2 rak'ahs greeting the masjid, tahiyyatul masjid, before sitting down in any time in which the prayer is not disliked. You come into the masjid, it is sunnah that you pray the 2 rak'ahs before sitting down. 2 rak'ahs after wudu, before your limbs dry. Who is the one from whom we received this prayer? Sayyiduna Bilal. And this is something he did of his own accord. And the Prophet ﷺ had the vision, hearing his footsteps in Jannah, and this was approved. We also have the 4 to 12 rak'ahs of duha prayer. And duha is, we call this the forenoon. So technically duha is when the sun rises to the point where the heat on the ground is enough for the camels to get up. So it really depends on where you are, but that's, you could say 9:30 to 10 o'clock. Maybe earlier. Also any nafil or voluntary prayer, the istikhara prayer, the prayer of need, salatul hajjah, which is 2 rak'ahs followed by a dua for your need. Your night prayer before the 2 days of Eid, night prayer in the last 10 nights of Ramadan, and Taraweeh is actually an emphasized sunnah. That's not in the previous list. We're looking at just daily prayers, but yes, Taraweeh is emphasized sunnah. Number 9, the night prayer in the first 10 nights of Dhul Hijjah, and lastly, prayer at night in the 15th of Sha'ban. So these are non-emphasized sunnah prayers. So what time do we have? Okay, 8 minutes. Should we venture into this or not? The Imam Ratib is not here. I'm the Imam Ratib for a while. So we could do this class all the way until 10 if we had to. We're not on the clock. Okay, so we come to the hardest part. And the reason why we'd say it's the hardest is that it requires conceptualizing different ways in which people forget things or omit things or mess things up while in prayer, and the various things they have to do to fix those errors. So it is the mercy of Allah Ta'ala that in the Sharia He gave to the Prophet ﷺ, our mistakes have a way of being corrected. The mistakes that we make in prayer, not all, but many of them, if the mistakes are of omission due to forgetfulness or being absent-minded, it's the mercy of Allah that in our Sharia we have ways of fixing that without having to stop the prayer and start all over. There are cases where a person might mess up so badly that they do have to start over, in which the prayer becomes invalid and they start over again. But in many of these scenarios, one does not start their prayer over from scratch. They do the 2 prostrations of forgetfulness at the very end. Now, if you see this picture in the introduction to this slide, I'm not sure where this comes from, but it's online. It's one of these memes, but this is kind of how people feel when they're standing in the 3rd or 4th rak'ah and they're not sure, is it the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, where are they? And they're trying to figure out what rak'ah they're on. So they're going back in their mind thinking about the previous movements. You actually have to be careful when that happens, because the fuqaha say, if you are in the prayer and you're a little stuck and confused about where you are and what rak'ah you're on, you may try to recall what rak'ah you're on by thinking about it, but you shouldn't stop dhikr while you're in prayer just to do that mental operation. So in other words, you shouldn't be like the person in this meme where you're just not doing anything, just thinking for an extended period of time, trying to figure out, okay, was that? You need to be engaged in dhikr or recitation of the Quran. And if while you're doing that, in the back of your mind, you're trying to recall where you were, that's fine. But this is how a lot of people feel when they get stuck in the prayer, they're not sure what rak'ah they're on. So we need to learn what to do when we find ourselves in that situation. How do we remedy it and fix the salat? And the way we remedy it is through what is called sajdatu sahu, or sajdatay as-sahu, the 2 prostrations. So the fuqaha say that if a person, out of forgetfulness or inattentiveness, omits one or more obligations of the prayer, the wajibat, he or she must perform 2 prostrations along with an extra tashahhud and 2 salams. So by saying obligations, what are we excluding here? We're excluding the sunnahs or the adab or those kinds of things. We're only looking at the wajibat. If one or more of the wajibat of prayer that we've covered are omitted out of forgetfulness, a person has to do these prostrations of forgetfulness. For example, a person performs an extra pillar. Should be once, they do it twice. Such as bowing twice in a single rak'ah. In all my years as a Muslim, I can't say I've ever seen that, where a person goes into ruku', Allahu Akbar, Sami' Allahu liman hamida, Allahu Akbar, into ruku' again, and then Sami' Allahu liman hamida a second. I've never seen that, but if someone did that, that would be adding an extra pillar. So that would be one thing. Could be forgetting to recite the Fatiha, or at least 3 verses, or its equivalent after the Fatiha. or rising to the third rak'ah after having forgotten to sit for the first tashahhud. I believe that most cases are the third. Most people who have to make the prostration of forgetfulness it's because they are confused about what rak'ah they're on. Sometimes they only remember when they're in the fourth rak'ah and they realize, wait a minute, I didn't sit for the tashahhud. Or the third rak'ah, they remember it. Sometimes they remember that they didn't sit for the tashahhud as they're halfway up into the standing for the third. Sometimes it's after they're standing erect. People remember at different times, but I believe that in most cases, people forget what rak'ah they're on, and that's the cause for their prostration of forgetfulness. So it doesn't really matter if you're adding or omitting the obligation. That would require the prostration of forgetfulness. So how do you do it, and what are the scenarios? So let's say you are praying dhuhr. You're in the second rak'ah in the sajda, and instead of sitting up to go into tashahhud, you rise all the way back up into the third rak'ah. What did you miss? The tashahhud. Is the tashahhud an obligation? Yes. Therefore, what do? You have to make the prostration of forgetfulness. Is that someone's device? Okay, so how do you do it? So you remembered. You're standing in the third rak'ah and you say to yourself, oh, I forgot the tashahhud. What do? Well, you continue your prayer. You finish that third rak'ah, you get up, you finish your fourth, you go into that tashahhud in the fourth rak'ah, you do your tashahhud as normal, and then you give your salams to the right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And then you go into sajda. Allahu Akbar. You do your dhikr. You rise into sitting again. Allahu Akbar. You go back into sajda. Allahu Akbar. You do your dhikr. How many sajdas? Those are two. Allahu Akbar. Now you're sitting again. You're sitting again. Now in that sitting, you do the tashahhud over again. You do it over again. And after that, you do your salawat, you do your dua, closing, and then Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, on both right and the left. And your prayer is done. You've done the two prostrations of forgetfulness. You've mended the prayer due to having forgotten an obligation. That is the basic way to do it in the Hanafi school. Now the Maliki school, I know I've confused some people doing it that in the Maliki way. It's a little different, but that's the basic way you do it. If all we struggled with was sometimes missing the tashahhud, forgetting to sit in the second rak'ah, then this will be pretty easy. But there are some details and scenarios that we have to learn, because there's all sorts of ways in which people can forget, or things that may arise in the prayer. And often things get very confusing. I heard of a case where there was an imam. He was praying dhuhr. Half of the jama'ah, they were there for the first takbir, and they're behind the imam. As they are praying behind the imam, you have another group of people who came in the second rak'ah. The imam, he rises, and group 2 who came late think that group 1, they think that he's rising for a 5th rak'ah, and they're saying subhanallah, and they're not standing. Group 2 who came late, as far as they're concerned, it's the 3rd rak'ah. They don't know. And there's this ensuing confusion, because one group is standing, the other one's sitting, and After the prayer is over, the imam's confused. Those who were there in the beginning are confused. The second group, they're confused, and they're all wondering, what should we have done? And these kind of scenarios do happen from time to time. I know one imam who had a situation like this. It was so confusing because the people who came, and then where he forgot, and then as he was trying to self-correct based on people saying subhanallah, he forgot something else. And at the end, he just gave the salam and said, let's start over again. And sometimes that's best. So let's look at some scenarios. All right. You have these slides. So if this is, you picture yourself in the masjid or picture yourself praying and this happens to you. And you have to go over the examples a few times to have the tasawwur, the conceptualization. If one begins to rise from sitting for the third rak'ah in a 3 or 4 rak'ah prayer, and then realizes he has not performed the first sitting, he should return to his sitting position. Okay? This is, the person is in dhuhr. They're in sajda. They rise. They should be sitting for their tashahhud, shouldn't they? They rise briefly and they stand up. But as they're getting back up, they're realizing that they forgot. You should return to the sitting position because you haven't fully stood up, have you? You should return to that sitting position and continue with your tashahhud. And this is wajib as long as you haven't fully stood up. If his knees were still bent when recalling and sitting back down, he doesn't do the prostration of forgetfulness, meaning it's a kind of grace period for you to catch yourself. And here I'm describing this to you. It's better if I was to demonstrate, where I sit on the ground and I get up from sajda and I rise just slightly. You're just getting up and you're realizing that you didn't do tashahhud, so you go right back down. If you catch yourself in that moment, that's something of a grace period. So you didn't fully rise, you're fine. Just go right back to where you in the sitting position where you should have been. Do your tashahhud, continue your prayer and finish it, and there's no need to do the prostration of forgetfulness. All right? But if you are closer to standing than sitting, when you remember this, you're not going to go all the way back up standing. You're still going to go back down sitting. But because there's no grace period, you've gone beyond, you're closer to standing than sitting, you still go back to sitting. But at the end of that prayer, you're going to do the 2 prostrations. So you have that short grace period if you just catch yourself in the beginning, where you can just quickly sit back down. But if you're halfway and you're closer to standing and then you still have to go back to the sitting position. However, you got to do the sajda sahw, the prostration of forgetfulness. Does that example make sense? You can conceptualize that, right? Just think about the person who catches themselves. If one forgot to sit for the final tashahhud and was getting back up, making it into a 5th rak'ah, the same rule applies as long as he has not prostrated. Meaning, if he catches himself, he can go back, right, and just finish that out. But if he goes back, if he did a prostration in the 5th rak'ah, if he goes all the way up and he's gone that far, then his fault of the prayer is invalidated, and that prayer becomes a nafil, a voluntary prayer. And as a voluntary prayer, this is where it gets interesting. So he's prayed 4 rak'ahs of dhuhr. He's in the tashahhud, or maybe he's not. He's in the 4th rak'ah, the dhuhr. He stands back up. This is now the 5th rak'ah. If he's standing back up and he's completed it to the point of going to sajda, guess what? That dhuhr does not count anymore. It counts as a nafil, a voluntary prayer. but it's 5 rak'ahs. Does that mean that in the 5th rak'ah he's going to be in tashahhud and then give the salams? No. He's going to stand back up and do a 6th rak'ah, because it's not a witr prayer, right? It's going to be even. So it's like 2, 4, 6. So he's doing it like this. If he did the prostration in the 5th rak'ah, the fard prayer is invalidated and it becomes voluntary. He should then add another rak'ah such that the extra 2 constitute an additional voluntary prayer. So 4 nafil and then 2 added to that. And after this, he's going to have to pray dhuhr all over again, right?
What if you did it in Maghrib?
If you did it in Maghrib, then it's 4 and he's not adding, right? So they only mentioned this for the prayer that would end with 5, right? Or end with 3, right? So odd numbers. If it's Maghrib and it's a 4th rak'ah, they finish that out. The prayers become nafil. They do the salams and they pray Maghrib over again properly.
Does he do the prostration of forgetfulness for the?
It's nafil. It's not. No, you just do your thing. You finish it out and then you go into do the fard. If someone needed to do sajda to sahu and forgot, okay, this is a good one. So let's say you're praying dhuhr, you get up for the 3rd rak'ah and you realize you forgot to do the tashahhud. So you know in the back of your mind that you forgot this and that you have to do the prostration of forgetfulness after you finish your 4th rak'ah. You go into the 4th rak'ah, you're in tashahhud, and you just give the full salams. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And you forgot to do the sajda to sahu. So you forgot the tashahhud in the 2nd rak'ah, and you forgot the prostration for forgetting. So you're forgetting that too. What do? Well, it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on you. It depends on what you are doing or not doing immediately after the prayer. So if you forgot to do those and you remembered right after the salams, you can go and do them as long as you haven't gone and done anything that would affect the validity of the prayer, such as talking or eating. So this is the person who, they're praying dhuhr, they miss the tashahhud, they go into the 4th rak'ah, they're supposed to do the sajda to sahu, but they forget and give the full salams. 5 seconds later, as they're sitting there in dhikr, they remember, oh, I didn't do that. In that moment, they can just go Allahu Akbar and do the 2 prostrations, the tashahhud, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and they're fine, alhamdulillah. Because between the ending of the prayer and remembering and doing the prostration of forgetfulness, nothing occurred in between those 2 things that would have invalidated the prayer if they were praying, such as talking to someone or eating or drinking, because it was just dhikr. On the other hand, if they prayed dhuhr, forgot tashahhud, forgot the prostration of forgetfulness, gave the full salams, and then they got up and ate a sandwich or just a chip and then they remembered, can they go and do the 2 prostrations? No. Because between the prayer and those prostrations, they engaged in something that would have invalidated the prayer if they were praying. So they, in their case, they can't do that. But what do? Do they have to pray over again? No, they don't. If they were omitted and remembered within the prayer time, they can make up the prayer. If it was later that they remembered, there's nothing to do, right? This is basically in that moment, if you remember, you have to attend to it. If it's happening later on, there's nothing for you to do. So, if they were omitted, the prostration of forgetfulness, and remembered later within the prayer time, make up the prayer. If you speak or eat in the time like there, the sajda to sahu is excused. So there's some confusing issues here, and the more details you go into, the more confusing it gets, because There's just lots of scenarios where we could forget. And between praying by yourself or praying behind an imam, and the imam forgetting and being corrected and either listening or not listening, adding a fifth rak'ah, do you follow him or do you stay still? There's lots of little details like this that come up. And then there's the issue of doubts. Yeah, you had a question?
Would walking away count as something that would break the prayer?
You didn't. I don't know. If it constitutes movement, but you're not praying, right? You're not eating or drinking or talking, just movement. I don't know. Now, something that comes up in relation to this is the issue of doubt. Sometimes you know very clearly that you forgot to do the tashahhud, but sometimes you get up and you have this uneasy sense that you forgot something, but you're unsure. Or you're not sure, did I pray 4 rak'ahs or 3? What rak'ah am I on? Now, when we say doubt, what we mean is kind of an even 50-50 split. Maybe I'm on the 3rd rak'ah, maybe I'm on the 4th. It could be either way, 50-50, I don't know. If you have a doubt, which is a 50-50 split, without any inclination towards one or the other while you're in prayer, meaning not after the salams, or while sitting at the end long enough to recite tashahhud, then the Hanafi school, they say that if this is the first time it's ever happened to you, as a young person probably, then you make the prayer up, you start over again. But if it's happened more than once, then you have to basically reach a determination, trying your best at taharri, to try your best to reach a determination about what rak'ah you're on. And to reach that determination, you're just not sure. Is it 3? Is it 4? You should build upon the prayer as your basis. This is al-bina. So just assume that it's the minimal number. Assume, if you're not sure if it's 4 or 3, assume it's 3. Assume it's less. That's what they say. So if you're not certain, assume the lower number and perform a sitting after each rak'ah, since any of them could be the even rak'ah, and then do sajda tasawwuf. I tell you, this is a lot more complicated in the Hanafi school than it is for others. Because the way they're describing it is, you get up, let's say you're praying dhuhr, and you get up you're not sure, is this the 3rd rak'ah or the 4th rak'ah? You have no idea. And you're thinking, what's the most likely case? You're not leaning to one or the other. Then you're going to do bina. You're going to say, okay, I assume it's the 3rd rak'ah. Okay. But could it be the 4th? Could be. You're not sure anymore. It could be. This means that it could be the 4th. The next rak'ah could be the 4th. If you already prayed 4 rak'ahs, the next rak'ah could be the 5th, right? So they say that you perform a sitting after each rak'ah of these rak'ahs that you're in doubt regarding, because that rak'ah could have been the even rak'ah and you're not aware. So you do all of that and then you do the sajda sahw at the end. This is the tougher one. It's like you prayed, you're not sure. You could be in the 3rd, you could be in the 4th, you don't know. So you assume it's the 3rd. So the next one you're going into is the 4th. But it might be the 5th. You're just not sure. So you do the tashahhud, you get back up, right? Depending on the rak'ah. If you got to make sure you're praying 4, obviously, if it's dhuhr, right? You're not going to be praying 5 on purpose. So this is where it gets confusing and you're doing the math in your head. But if you are unsure, if it's even or odd, you're just going to be doing the tashahhud and getting back up for each of those. And I pray that never happens to any of you, but this is what they discuss in the books of fiqh. Remember what we said before. Fiqh, as a science, is addressing all sorts of human possibilities, all sorts of scenarios, even outrageous ones that are very unlikely to happen in our own life. Hopefully, that won't happen to you. And hopefully, if it does happen to you, it's a fairly simple case of you remembering as you're getting up in the third rak'ah that you forgot the tashahhud, or you forgot to recite something, and then you can fix it with the prostration of forgetfulness at the end.
So is it allowed to complete the prayer if you're in doubt, and just pray again all over again?
If you get so confused to where nothing really makes sense anymore, then you can do this. Yeah. And I think that would be a more easier solution. Okay, so next class. We got through the hard stuff now. And for the test, I'm just going to ask you the basic stuff. The stuff that most people face, not the scenarios. Next class, inshallah, prostration of recitation, it's very easy. Qada, we'll talk about that. Making up missed prayers. The Friday prayer, the Eid prayers, the Janazah prayer, a little bit about burial is included there. And after that, it's a few miscellaneous things, and we'll have our test, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wallahu wa rasuluhu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallama ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
I have a question.
Sure.
Sometimes even here, whenever they read the prostration of forgetfulness, they do it right at the very end and they don't sandwich it between the two sentences. So that's not correct?
You mean like they're doing assalamu alaikum and then they go
No, they just say it at the very end and they do the salam.
at the end? I mean, that would be the Shafi'i way, I think. And in the Maliki way, we have 2 prostrations before any salam at all, and then we have some cases where it's the 2 prostrations after the salams.
Yeah, I've heard that.
It depends on whether you're adding something or whether you omitted something. They make a distinction.